include in the body of the chapter because these explorations could be too much, so I decided to include them here as an addendum in case you are interested in exploring them further. To help you make the connection, I refer to each determinant, or dynamic, by title and number from Chapter 2. 5. Self-interest. While self-interest is the primary motivator for most people, organizations, and governments, the question of which self is most important, is it the individual, the family, the tribe, the state, the country, the empire, humankind, all living things, the universe? The following diagram shows the possible units. The ones on the top are more encompassing and the ones on the bottom are the less consolidated. What are most people in your society, and what are you willing to die for? The self that people are most attached to is the one they will do the most to protect, and this will drive their behaviors. For example, when people are willing to die for their country will be more likely to be protected than if the individual's self is more important, in which case individuals will run from deadly combat. Within countries, one might see tribes be much more important than countries, which would lead to an entirely different dynamic than if the opposite were true. That is why I envy this dynamic worth keeping an eye on, especially in conics. In looking at history across countries, I saw changes in the primary unit that most people and societies optimized for. For example, before around 1650, tribes and states were more important than countries. History shows that the groupings that people collect in and that are the most important to them evolve. Gatherings of individuals and families make up a tribe. Gatherings of tribes make up a state. Gatherings of states make up a country. Gatherings of states or countries that are under uni-ed control make up an empire. Sometimes smaller groupings coalesce into bigger ones, changing boundaries in the process. For example, over the last 150 years in Europe, states coalesced into nations, many of which have coalesced into the European Union. And sometimes they break up into smaller units. For example, the Soviet Union broke up into its constituent countries, and some Middle Eastern countries have broken up into warring tribes. Over the last few years, the world has been moving from being more globalist to being more nationalist. At the same time, the United States appears to be losing its cohesion as people's views about how they should be with each other are becoming more divergent. These divergences are leading people to migrate to the states that align with their preferences, causing those states to be more relevant individually than as parts of a uni-ed whole. History and logic show us that these changes in domestic and international orders are typically accompanied by conics because there is a lot of disagreement about how they should work. Example, what states' rights are relative to national rights. Because most people haven't seen such changes before, they fail to recognize them for what they are. They are important to stay on top of because they show the changing locus of control, which typically signals a change in one's rights and obligations. Think about it. What are you seeing happen? Are you seeing coalescing or dissolving? From what level to what other level? What implications do these changes have for you and where you want to be? 6. The drive to gain and keep wealth and power. For the purposes of discussing the big cycles in later chapters, it's worth defining wealth a bit more specifically and looking at its impact on countries that have it or lack it. I believe the following to be by and large true. Wealth equals buying power. Without getting too nuanced, let's call wealth buying power to distinguish it from money and credit. That distinction is important because the value of money and credit changes. For example, when a lot of money and credit are created, they go down in value, so having more money won't necessarily give one more wealth or buying power. Real wealth is not equal to financial wealth. Real wealth is what people buy because they want to have and use it, such as a house, car, streaming video service, etc. Real wealth has intrinsic value. Financial wealth consists of financial assets that are held to A, receive an ongoing income in the future, and or B, be sold in the future to get money to buy the real assets people will want. Financial wealth has no intrinsic value. Making wealth equals being productive. Over the long run, the wealth and buying power you have will be a function of how much you produce. That is because real wealth doesn't last long, and neither do inheritances. That is why being continuously productive is so important. If you look at societies that expropriated the wealth of the rich and tried to live off it and weren't productive, you will see that it didn't take them long to become poor. The less productive a society, the less wealthy and hence the less powerful. By the way, spending money on investment and infrastructure rather than on consumption tends to lead to greater productivity, so investment is a good leading indicator of prosperity. Wealth equals power. That is because if one has enough wealth, one can buy most anything: physical property, the work and loyalty of others, education, healthcare, influential powers of all sorts, and so on. Through time and across countries, history has shown that there is a symbiotic relationship between those who have wealth and those who have political power, and that the type of deal they have between them determines the ruling order. That ruling order continues until the rulers are overthrown by others who grab the wealth and power for themselves. Wealth and power are mutually supportive. For example, in 1717 the British East India Company actively brought together financial capital, people with commercial capabilities, and people with military capabilities to force India's Mughal emperor to trade with them, which was the first step toward the British colonization of India. The fall of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, and then its complete failure in the 19th century, when the British exiled the emperor and executed his children after the 1857 Indian Rebellion. The British did these things because they had the wealth and power to do them in pursuit of more wealth and power. Wealth decline equals power decline. There isn't an individual, organization, country, or empire that hasn't failed when it lost its buying power. One must earn an amount that is at least equal to the amount one spends. Those who spend modestly and have a surplus are more sustainably successful than those who earn a lot more and have deficits. History shows that when an individual, organization, country, or empire spends more than what they earn, misery and turbulence are ahead. History also shows that countries that have higher percentages of people who are self-sufficient tend to be more socially, politically, and economically stable. 9. The big multigenerational psychological cycle. The rises and declines of countries correspond to these psychological and economic cycles in the following ways and stages. Because these stages are so useful in understanding the behavior of a country's people and leaders, I am always trying to assess what stages different countries are in. Stage 1. People and their countries are poor and they think of themselves as poor. In this stage, most people have very low incomes and subsistence lifestyles. As a result, they don't waste money because they value it a lot, and they don't have much debt because nobody wants to lend to them. Some people have potential and some do not, but in most cases their poverty and lack of resources prevent them from gaining the education and other capabilities that would allow them to pull themselves up. One's inherited circumstances and approach to life are the biggest determinants of who emerges richer from this stage and who does not. How fast countries evolve through this stage depends on their cultures and their abilities. I call countries in this stage early stage emerging countries. Those that advance typically work hard and gradually accumulate more money than they need to survive, which they save because they worry about not having enough in the future. The evolution through this stage to the next typically takes about a generation. Starting about 40 years ago until about 10 to 15 years ago, the Asian tigers of Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea and then China were examples of economies in this stage. Stage 2. People and their countries are rich but still think of themselves as poor. Because people who grew up with financial insecurity typically don't lose their financial cautiousness, people in this stage still work hard, sell a lot to foreigners, have pegged exchange rates, save a lot, and invest silently in real assets like real estate, gold, and local bank deposits, and in bonds of the reserve currency countries. Because they have a lot more money, they can and do invest in the things that make them more productive. Example, human capital development, infrastructure, research and development, etc. This generation of parents wants to educate their children well and get them to work hard to be successful. They also improve their resource allocation systems, including their capital markets and their legal systems. This is the most productive phase of the cycle. countries in this stage experience rapidly rising income growth and rapidly rising productivity growth at the same time. The productivity growth means two things. 1. A nation is not a problem, and 2. The country can become more competitive. During this stage, debts typically do not rise significantly relative to incomes, and sometimes they decline. This is a very healthy period and a terrific time to invest in a country if it has adequate property rights protections. You can tell countries in this stage from those in the RST stage because they have gleaming new cities next to old ones, high savings rates, rapidly rising incomes, and typically, rising foreign exchange reserves. I call countries in this stage late-stage emerging countries. While countries of all sizes can go through this stage, when big countries go through it, they are typically emerging into great world powers. Stage 3. People and their countries are rich and think of themselves as rich. At this stage, people's incomes are high, so labor becomes more expensive. But their prior investments in infrastructure, capital goods, and research and development are still paying off by producing productivity gains that sustain their high living standards. Priorities shift from an emphasis on working and saving in order to protect oneself from bad times, to savoring the things in life. People become more comfortable spending more. Arts and sciences typically Irish. This change in the prevailing psychology is reinforced as a new generation of people who did not experience the bad times become an increasingly large percentage of the population. Signs of this change in mindset are reacted in statistics that show reduced work hours and big increases in expenditures on leisure and luxury goods relative to necessities. At their best, these periods are early and mid-stage Renaissance periods. Large countries in this stage almost always become world economic and military powers. Typically, they develop their militaries in order to project and protect their global interests. Prior to the mid-20th century, large countries at this stage literally controlled foreign governments and created empires from them to provide the cheap labor and cheap natural resources they needed to remain competitive. Starting in the early to mid-20th century, when the U.S. empire began ruling by speaking softly and carrying a big stick, American influence and international agreements have allowed developed countries to have access to emerging countries' cheap labor and investment opportunities without directly controlling their governments. In this stage, countries are on top of the world and are enjoying it. I call countries in this stage peak health countries. The United States was in this stage from 1950 to 1965. China is now moving into it. The key is to maintain the determinants leading to strength for as long as possible. Stage 4. People and their countries are poorer and still think of themselves as rich. In this stage, debts rise relative to income. The psychological shift behind this leveraging up occurs because the people who lived through the RST2 stages have died or become irrelevant, and those whose behavior matters most are used to living well and not worrying about the pain of not having enough money. Because the workers in these countries earn and spend a lot, they become expensive, and because they are expensive, they experience slower real income growth rates. Since they are reluctant to constrain their spending in line with their reduced income growth rates, they lower their savings rates, increase their debts, and cut corners. Because their spending continues to be strong, they continue to appear rich, even though their balance sheets are deteriorating. The reduced level of ESG investments in infrastructure, capital goods, and research and development slows their productivity gains. Their cities and infrastructure become older and less ESG than in the two previous stages. They increasingly rely on their reputation rather than on their competitiveness to fund their deficits. Countries typically spend a lot of money on the military at this stage to protect their global interests, sometimes in very large amounts because of wars. Often, though not always, countries run twin deficits, i.e., both balance of payments and government deficits. In the last few years of this stage, bubbles frequently occur. Whether because of wars or bursting financial bubbles or both, what type of this stage is an accumulation of debt that can't be paid back in non-depreciated money. I call countries in this stage early declining countries. While countries of all sizes can go through this stage, when big countries go through it, they are typically approaching their decline as great empires. Stage 5. People in their countries are poor and they think of themselves as poor. This is when the gaps described in Stage 4 cease to exist, and the reality of the country's situation is hitting home. After bubbles burst and deleveragings occur, private debts grow, while private sector spending, asset values, and net worths decline in a self-reinforcing negative cycle. To compensate, government debt and government deficits grow, and central bank printing of money typically increases. Central banks and governments cut real interest rates and increase nominal GDP growth so that it is comfortably above nominal interest rates in order to ease debt burdens. As a result of these low real interest rates, weak currencies, and poor economic conditions, their debt and equity assets perform poorly. Increasingly, these countries have to compete with less expensive countries that are in earlier stages of development. Their currencies depreciate, and they like it because it makes the deleveraging less painful. As an extension of these economic and financial trends, countries in this stage see their power in the world decline further. I call countries in this stage clearly declined countries. It typically takes a long time, if it ever happens, for clearly declined empires' psychologies and attributes to go through the full cycle that brings them to their old peaks again. The Romans and the Greeks never have, though the Chinese have a few times. 11. Humanity's inventiveness. Humanity's capacity to invent solutions to its problems and to identify how to make things better has proven to be far more powerful than all of its problems combined. Because knowledge is gained more than it is lost, it advances more in spurts and sputters than in cycles that have downs as well as ups. The spurts come when societies are in the upward swings of the big cycle, and the sputters come when they are in the downward swings. The Renaissance periods of great creativity that produce advances in just about all areas, the sciences, the arts, philosophies about how people should be with each other and govern, etc., come more during the peaceful and prosperous parts of the big cycle, when the systems for creating innovations are good rather than bad. While species' inventions and the ways they come about have evolved through time, they have unwaveringly evolved toward doing and making things better, replacing manual labor with machines and automation, and making people around the world more interconnected. There are always new inventions and improvements. The most important and undeniable trend of technological advancement has been toward higher living standards. That trend is likely to accelerate in unimaginable ways. Beyond that, computerization is changing the character of decision-making, making it faster and less emotional. As helpful as that is, it also poses certain dangers. The degree of inventiveness and innovation in a society is the main driver of its innovative and commercial spirit, is the lifeblood of a thriving economy. Without innovation, productivity growth would grind to a halt. Innovations that allow a country's workers to produce more relative to the rest of the world feed into their cost competitiveness, making them more attractive places to do business. The drive to tinker and invent, to discover, to improve from prior failures, this is how people learn and end new and better ways of creating things of value. In a market-based system, the most powerful way to drive innovation is to bring new ideas to market and to commercialize and profit from them. The marketplace is incredibly scient at weeding out bad ideas and pricing good ones. In this way, the concepts of innovation and commercialism go hand in hand. They capture whether people in a society value new knowledge and the creation of new things, and whether incentives are aligned to encourage them to seek a profit by commercializing them. In other words, innovation plus commercial spirit plus thriving capital markets. Great productivity gains. Increases in wealth and power. Because there are big differences in the strengths of these determinants, I try to measure them and take them into consideration in my model. 17. Class struggles. For as long as there has been recorded history, in almost all societies a very small percentage of the population have controlled most of the wealth and power. Naturally, those who benefit from and control the system by and large like the system and seek to maintain it. Because those with wealth can influence those with power, and because those with power can influence those with wealth, these ruling classes or elites have alliances among themselves and want to maintain the existing order with everyone following its dictums and laws. Even as the system increases the gaps between those with power and wealth and those without them. As a result, all internal orders are run by certain classes of people who have wealth and power and who operate in symbiotic relationships with each other to maintain the order. Though aligned not to disrupt the order that benefits them, throughout time these elites have struggled with each other over wealth and power, and have also struggled with non-elites who want wealth and power. When times are good and most people prosper, the struggles are smaller. When times are bad, the struggles are worse. And when things are very bad for a large percentage of the people, example, there is an unresolvable debt crisis, a very bad economy, a very bad act of nature, the resulting suffering, stress, and struggles typically lead to revolutions and/or civil wars. As Aristotle said a long time ago, the poor and the rich quarrel with one another, and whichever side gets the better, instead of establishing a just or popular government, regards political supremacy as the prize of victory. Classically, the big cycle transpires with periods of peace and productivity that increase wealth in a disproportionate way, which leads to a very small percentage of the population gaining and controlling exceptionally large percentages of the wealth and power, then becoming overextended, which leads to encountering bad times that hurt those who are the least wealthy and powerful the hardest, which then leads to conflicts that produce revolutions and/or civil wars, which then lead to the creation of a new order and the cycle beginning again. Throughout time and in all countries, the people who have the wealth are the people who own the means of wealth production, and, in order to maintain it, they work with the people who have the power to set and enforce the rules. While that has always been the case, the exact form of it has evolved and will continue to evolve. For example, as explained in Chapter 1, for most of the 13th through 19th centuries, the prominent internal order all around the world consisted of the ruling classes or elites being 1, the monarchy, which ruled in conjunction with 2, the nobility, which controlled the means of production, and/or 3, the military. Workers were viewed as part of the means of production and had essentially no say in how the order was run. Even societies that had little or no contact with each other developed in similar ways because they had similar situations to deal with, and because the nature of their decision-making was similar. Across countries there always were, and still are, different levels of governance at the country level, the state-province level, the municipality level, etc. And there are timeless and universal ways that they operate and interact with each other that have been pretty consistent across the world. The monarchs needed people to manage the day-to-day operations for them. The top people were ministers, who oversaw the bureaucracies of people who did the various jobs that needed to be done for government to work. What exists today is simply the result of the natural evolutions of these timeless and universal ways of interacting, with different countries' own cultural avairs thrown in. For example, the roles of the ministers who helped the monarchs evolved into the roles of prime ministers and other ministers that now exist in almost all countries. Over time, these systems have evolved in varied but logical ways as a result of struggles for wealth and power. For example, in England around 1200 there was a wealth and power struggle that evolved gradually at RST and then abruptly into a civil war, which is how these shifts tend to evolve, between the nobility and the monarchy. Like most of these struggles, the GHT was over money and the power to determine who got how much money. The monarchy under King John wanted to get more tax money and the nobles wanted to give less tax money. They disagreed over how much say the nobles should have on the matter, so they had a civil war. The nobles won and gained more power to set the rules, which led to what the RST called a council, which soon became the RST Parliament, which evolved into what exists in England today. The peace treaty that formalized this deal into law in 1215 is called the Magna Carta. Like most laws, this one didn't matter much relative to power, so another civil war broke out in which the nobles and the monarchy again fought over wealth and power. In 1225 they wrote up a new Magna Carta under Henry III, which those with power got to interpret and enforce. A few decades later, the guiding picked up again. In that war, the nobles cut out tax payments to the monarchy, which forced Henry III to give in to the nobles' demands. These struggles went on constantly, leading the orders to evolve. Fast forward to the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries and one can see that there were big changes in the sources of wealth. At RST because of global exploration and colonialism and later because of the invention of capitalism and labor-saving machines that fueled the industrial revolutions, which made those who profited from these sources of wealth more powerful, i.e., the shifts in wealth and power over these centuries were from A, landowning nobles and monarchies to B, capitalists and elected representatives or autocratic government leaders. Almost all countries made these shifts, some peacefully but most painfully. For example, in France for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the king ruled in a balance of power arrangement with three other classes: 1. The clergy, 2. The nobility, and 3. The commoners. There were representatives of these groups who voted. The RST2 classes, who accounted for only 2% of the population, had more votes than, or eventually the same number of votes as, the commoners, who made up 98% of the population. They called this internal order based on three classes the Ancien Regime. Then practically overnight it changed in a revolutionary way via the French Revolution, which began on May 5, 1789, when the third class, the commoners, had enough of that system, overthrew the others, and took the power for itself. In most countries around the world at the time, the same basic ruling order prevailed, i.e., the monarchy and nobles, who accounted for a very small percentage of the population and had most of the wealth, ruled until all of a sudden there was a civil war revolution that led the old order to be replaced with a very different new ruling order. Though the internal orders for managing these class struggles were and are different in different countries, they evolved similarly across countries. For example, they evolved both gradually and abruptly, and they evolved into those orders that now exist in all countries. I expect they will continue to evolve gradually and abruptly to produce new domestic orders. While the classes who have the wealth and political power change, the processes that produce these changes have remained pretty much the same through time right up to today. These changes have occurred through struggles that have led to both A. Peaceful reforms through negotiations and B. Violent reforms via civil wars and revolutions. The peaceful reforms tend to come earlier in the cycle and the violent civil wars and revolutionary reforms tend to come later in the cycle for logical reasons that we will delve into later. I cannot overstate the importance of class struggles relative to individual struggles. We, especially those of us in the United States, which is thought of as a melting pot, tend to focus more on individual struggles and not give adequate attention to class struggles. I didn't fully realize the importance of class struggles until I did my extensive study of history, which led me to this principle. In all countries throughout time, people find themselves within classes, either because they choose to be with people like them or because others stereotype them as part of certain groups. Power is usually shared among 3 or 4 classes. Who and what people feel most connected with, are around most, and are most like will determine which class or classes they are in. How people are classed determines who their friends or allies are and who their enemies are. While rich and poor and right and left are the most common big class distinctions, there are many other important distinctions, such as race, ethnicity, religion, gender, lifestyle, and location. Generally speaking, people tend to cluster in these classes, and when times are good early in the cycle there is more harmony among these classes, and when things are bad there is more guiding among them. While I love that the United States is the country where these class distinctions matter least, people's classes still matter in the US, and they matter a lot more during stressful times when class conflicts intensify. To help you get the picture in a more intimate way, let's do a simple exercise. Assume that most people who don't know you well look at you as being in a member of one or several classes, because that's a good assumption. Now, to imagine how you are perceived, look at the following list and ask yourself which classes you fall into. After you answer that, ask yourself which classes you feel an affinity for and expect to be your allies. Which classes do you not like or view as your enemies? Which ones are the ruling classes, and which ones are the revolutionary classes who want to topple them? Which ones are on the ascent, and which ones are on the decline? You might consider writing these down and thinking about them, because during periods of greater ICT the classes you are in or are assumed to be in will become more important in determining who you will be with and against, what you will do, and where you will end up. 1. Rich or poor? 2. Right, left, or moderate? 3. Race? 4. Ethnicity? 5. Religion? 6. Gender? 7. Lifestyle? 8. Location? Still today, only a small percentage of the population, which comes from only a few of these classes, has most of the wealth and power and rules as the elites. To me, it is clear that the capitalist class now has the most financial power in most countries, and political power in democracies lies in the hands of all the people who choose to vote. While in autocracies it lies in the hands of the limited number of people selected by whatever process they have to make selections. So, for the most part today, those are the ruling classes and the elites who oversee the current domestic orders, though they are now under attack, so this is probably shifting. For example, there is now a big movement in the United States to be much more inclusive of members of different classes in both the capitalist money-making world and in the political world. These shifts can be good or bad depending on whether they are handled peacefully or violently, and smartly or stupidly. One timeless and universal truth that I saw go back as far as I studied history, since before Confucius, who lived around 500 BCE, is that those societies that draw on the widest range of people and give them responsibilities based on their merits rather than privileges are the most sustainably successful. As 1, they find the best talent to do their jobs well. 2, they have diversity of perspectives. And 3, they are perceived as the fairest, which fosters social stability. I presume that the current internal orders of countries, like those of the past, will continue evolving to become something different through the struggles of different classes with each other over how to divide wealth and political power. Because this wealth and power dynamic is very important, it is worth watching closely to discern which classes are gaining and which ones are losing wealth and power, and also to discern the reactions to these shifts that lead the cycles to change. So, as I see it, everything is changing in classic ways, driven by a trident or perpetual motion machine. This machine has produced, and is producing, different systems, such as communism, fascism, autocracies, democracies, and evolutionary descendants and hybrids of these, such as state capitalism, in China. It will produce new forms of internal orders to divide wealth and allocate political power that will affect our lives greatly, all based on how people choose to be with each other, and how human nature enters into how they make their choices. 18. The political left-right cycle. Capitalists and socialists don't just have different self-interests, they have different deep-seated ideological beliefs that they are willing to GHT for. The typical perspective of the rightist capitalist is that self-sufficiency, hard work, productivity, limited government interference, allowing people to keep what they make, and individual choice are morally good and good for society. They also believe that the private sector works better than the public sector, that capitalism works best for most people, and that self-made billionaires are the biggest contributors to society. Capitalists are typically driven crazy by financial supports for people who lack productivity and profitability. To them, making money equals being productive equals getting what one deserves. They don't pay much attention to whether the economic machine is producing opportunity and prosperity for most people. They can also overlook the fact that their form of profit-making is suboptimal when it comes to achieving the goals of most people. For example, in a purely capitalist system, the provision of excellent public education, which is clearly a leading cause of higher productivity and greater wealth across a society, is not a high priority. The typical perspective of the leftist socialist is that helping each other, having the government support people, and sharing wealth and opportunity are morally good and good for society. They believe that the private sector is by and large run by capitalists who are greedy, while common workers, such as teachers, re-guiders, and laborers, contribute more to society. Socialists and communists tend to focus on dividing the pie well and typically aren't very good at increasing its size. They favor more government intervention, believing those in government will be fairer than capitalists, who are simply trying to exploit people to make more money. I've had exposure to all kinds of economic systems all over the world and have seen why the ability to make money, save it, and put it into capital is an effective motivator of people and allocator of resources that raises people's living standard. Capitalism is also a source of wealth, and opportunity gaps that are unfair, can be counterproductive, are highly cyclical, and can be destabilizing. In my opinion, the greatest challenge for policymakers is to engineer a capitalist economic system that raises productivity and living standards without worsening inequities and instabilities. 21. The big balance of power cycle that drives the big peace war cycle both within countries and between countries. In studying a lot of history and experiencing a tiny sliver of it myself, I have seen how the balance of power dynamic drives virtually all struggles for power, e.g., politics within organizations, local and national politics in shaping the domestic order, and international politics in shaping the world order. It applies equally well to determining the formations and changes in world orders as in domestic orders. The dynamic transpires in a series of steps explained here, though how exactly it unfolds depends on the order and people at the time these stages unfold. Step 1. The formation of alliances. When there isn't roughly equal power, the more powerful party will take advantage of and control the less powerful party. To neutralize the stronger party, the weaker party naturally NDS other parties to join it in opposing the stronger party so collectively they can have the same or more power as the opposition. The weaker party does this by giving the other parties what they want in return for their support. If the formerly weaker party collectively gains more power than the formerly stronger party from doing this, the formerly stronger party cuts deals with other parties to ally with them to eliminate the superiority of the opposition. As a result, allies who have very different vested interests unite in opposing the common enemy, as the saying goes. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. This dynamic naturally leads to the different sides having roughly equal amounts of power and splits within themselves. Sometimes the differences within the parties are so great that some segments want to destroy the other segments in order to gain control of their party. This alliance and enemy-forming dynamic happens at all different levels of relationships, from the most important international alliances that to any the most important elements of the world order down to the most important alliances within countries that to any the internal orders. Down to those within states, within cities, within organizations, and among individuals. The most important evolutionary shift to a ECTDs has been the shrinking of the world to make allies and enemies more global. In the old days they were less global. Example, European countries formed alliances to GHT other European countries. Asian countries did the same in Asia, etc. But as the world has shrunk because of improved transportation and communications, it has become more interconnected and bigger, and more global alliances have developed. That is why there were two big sides in World Wars I and II and likely will be going forward. Step 2. War to determine the winners and losers. Big GHTS typically happen when both sides have roughly equal powers and existential differences exist between them. Big GHTS typically don't occur when there are big asymmetries in power because it would be stupid for obviously weaker entities to GHT obviously stronger ones, and if they did GHT, the GHTS would be small in scale. However, sometimes when there are roughly equal levels of power on both sides, stalemates and gridlocks rather than big GHTS can occur when the existential threat of harming oneself in the process of trying to beat the other side is greater than the gains that would come from having a GHT to the death. For example, when there is mutually assured destruction, example, as the US and the Soviet Union faced, there is more likely to be a stand-o than a GHT. While these big GHTS are typically violent, they can be nonviolent if the entities have nonviolent rules of engagement that they adhere to that allow the resolution of disputes, most importantly the existential ones. For example, In the 2020 U.S. election, the two political parties had roughly equal amounts of power and irreconcilable differences, so that they had a big GHT for political control. That led to the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, but eventually the peaceful transfer of political power as set out in the Constitution prevailed. History has shown that, when there are not clear rules and or when the parties don't abide by them, the guiding will be far more brutal, often to the death. Step 3. Fighting among the winners. History shows us that after the GHT for power in which the common enemy is defeated, those who united against the common enemy typically GHT among themselves for power, and those in the losing party do the same as they plan their next attack. I call this the purge, state of the balance of power dynamic. It has happened in all cases, with the Reign of Terror in France and the Red Terror in the Soviet Union being the most well-known. This same sort of guiding has happened between countries, as with the US and the Soviet Union, who were allies in World War II. Similarly, the United Front of Chinese Communists and Nationalists that fought the Japanese in the war immediately battled each other for power when the war was over. Understanding this typical dynamic, one should look out for internal guiding among the winners right after the big war is over. We should always watch whether the factions within the same parties are inclined to GHT each other for control of their parties. When new regimes come to power, watch what they do with the enemies they defeated. What happens next depends on the system and the leaders in the system. In the US and generally in democracies, the rules allow the losers to remain unharmed and unconstrained, which allows them to try to regain power and GHT again. In harsh autocracies, the losers are eliminated one way or another. Step 4. Peace and prosperity occur but eventually lead to excesses re-acted in large wealth and opportunity gaps and over-indebtedness. History shows us that because of this dynamic, the best of times, i.e., when there is peace and prosperity, typically happens after a war. When the leadership and power structure are clearly established, so there isn't big guiding for power within the country or with other countries, because there is an obviously more powerful entity that enables the less powerful entities to have a good life. Step 5. Increasing ICT leads to revolutionary changes in domestic and world orders. For as long as there is peace and prosperity for the majority of the people, which will only be the case if the system is fair and the majority of the people remain self-disciplined and productive, peace and prosperity are likely to continue. However, as previously discussed, periods of peace and prosperity also tend to encourage big wealth gaps and debt bubbles that lead to connexes when prosperity fades and there are other things to GHT over. This cycle tracks the internal and external order and disorder cycles that we will explore in chapters 5 and 6. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 created countries, i.e., sovereign states, as we now know them. Japan from 1971 to 1990 is an exception with regards to the military. Germany in World War I and the UK in World War II are classic examples. For example, in the last century, the wealth share of the top 1% in the US ranged from close to 50% in the 1920s to a bit over 20% in the late 1970s. In the UK, it ranged from over 70% in 1900 to around 15% in the 1980s and is currently around 35%. These shifts in inequality can be seen at least as far back as the Roman Republic, as Walter Scheidel describes in The Great Leveler. For example, for much of history Europe, China, and most countries had monarchs and nobles as the ruling classes, yet they were a bit different. In Europe, the church was also part of the ruling mix. In Japan, the monarchy, the military, and the business community were the ruling elites. That doesn't mean that those who run autocracies don't ultimately report to the people because the people could overthrow the government. Chapter 3. The big cycle of money, credit, debt, and economic activity. What most people and their countries want most is wealth and power, and money and credit are the biggest influences on how wealth and power rise and decline. If you don't understand how money and credit work, you can't understand how the system works, and if you don't understand how the system works, you can't understand what's coming at you. For example, if you don't understand how the Roaring Twenties led to a debt bubble and a big wealth gap, how the bursting of that debt bubble led to the 1930-33 Great Depression, and how the Depression led to conflicts over wealth all over the world, you won't understand why Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. You also won't understand why, soon after his inauguration, he announced a new plan in which the central government and the Federal Reserve would together provide a lot of money and credit, a change that was similar to what was happening in other countries at the time, and that is similar to what is happening today in response to the pandemic-caused crisis. Unless you understand how money and credit work, you can't understand why the world changed as it did in 1933 or what happened next, how the war was won and lost, and why the New World Order was created as it was in 1945. But when you can recognize the underlying mechanics that drove all of those things in the past, you can also understand what is happening now and have a much better sense about what is likely to happen in the future. In speaking with several of the world's most renowned historians and political practitioners, including current and former heads of state, foreign ministers, finance ministers, and central bankers, we recognize that we each held different pieces of the puzzle to explain how the world works. I had been lacking an adequate practical understanding of the workings of politics and geopolitics, and they lacked an adequate